It is the 31st of January 1943. For weeks, the German Sixth Army has been trapped in the city of Stalingrad. Orders from Berlin demand a suicidal last stand. But the horrific conditions on the ground have taken their toll. The army's commander receives a final, cynical promotion to the rank of field marshal, as no German of that rank has ever been taken alive. However, with the lives of nearly 250,000 men in his hands, the man chooses to end the carnage and surrender. So ends the bloodiest battle in human history, and the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. The man's name, Friedrich Paulus, the German commander at Stalingrad. The man known to history as Friedrich Paulus was born on the 23rd of September 1890 in the parish of Guxhagen in the province of Hesse-Nassau in the German Empire, what is now central Germany. His full baptismal name was Friedrich Wilhelm Ernst Paulus. In later years, Paulus tried to give the impression that he was of the minor German nobility, and people, both in his own time and after, often referred to him as von Paulus. There is no evidence that his family were aristocratic, and so the use of the Germanic nobiliary particle von was erroneous. Friedrich's father was Ernst Paulus, a civil servant who worked as a treasurer or bookkeeper for a correctional school. He was, by all accounts, a fairly uncontroversial figure, a competent bureaucrat with moderate politics who did not shape Friedrich's life in any particular way. His mother was Bertha Paulus, née Nettelbeck, the daughter of the director of the same correctional school that Ernst worked in. Bertha and Ernst had 2 children other than Friedrich, a second son, Ernst Jr., and a daughter named Cornelia. Bertha suffered from poor health throughout much of their childhoods. Friedrich's early life was a mobile one. His father was promoted to become chief treasurer of the provincial government of Hesse-Nassau in the course of the 1890s, and the family moved to the city of Kassel. Later they moved to Marburg. It was a comfortably middle-class upbringing by the standards of the time. Much of Friedrich's education was completed at the Wilhelmsgymnasium in Kassel, a school founded in 1886, which would end up being used over half a century later to detain Soviet prisoners of war in a strange link between Paulus's early and later life. When he completed his final exams there in 1909, his final report from the institution stated that he wished to join the Navy. It was not into the German Imperial Navy he headed though, instead remaining on land to train as a cadet officer attached to the 111th Infantry Regiment from early 1910 onwards, after the Navy rejected his application. He had also briefly begun taking a law course at the University of Marburg in the winter term of 1909, but quickly decided it was not for him and signed up for the army. The next few years were ones of gradual promotion for Paulus. After just over half a year as an ensign, he was promoted to become a second lieutenant in October 1910, and then a full lieutenant in August 1911. His foray into military life also accounted for his marriage. Within the 111th Infantry Regiment, 2 Romanian brothers, Ephraim and Constantine Rosetti Solescu, were serving alongside Paulus. Their father Alexander had been the Romanian consul general or ambassador to Germany. He had later returned to the Balkans, but his wife had remained in Germany with their 5 children. a development which explains Ephraim and Constantine's presence in the German army. Through them, Friedrich was introduced to their sister, Helena Constans, who was a year older than Paulus. A quick courtship followed, and on the 4th of July 1912 the pair were married, much to the consternation of Helena's mother, who claimed that her line was ultimately descended from the nobility of the Balkans, going back to the line of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. Helena was a well-educated woman who had spent much of her youth in Constantinople and spoke several languages, including French. They would have 3 children, a daughter named Olga, born in 1914, and twin sons, one named Friedrich after his father, and the other Ernst Alexander after his 2 grandfathers. Paulus's entry into the military and first years within it in the early 1910s was a period of pronounced tension in European politics. The unification of Germany and the formation of the German Empire back in 1871 had shattered the political equilibrium that had existed in Europe since the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. Suddenly, there was a threat to the hegemony which Britain had enjoyed for over half a century, particularly so because Germany was rapidly industrializing and its economic performance during the Second Industrial Revolution in the period from 1870 to 1920 outpaced that of Britain. To compound matters, lobby groups had emerged in Germany in the 1880s that insisted that Germany should have its share of the spoils of the European age of imperialism, and Germany had acquired a number of large, though economically unproductive colonies in Africa and in the Western Pacific. During Paulus's first years in the Imperial German Army, it seemed as though colonial tensions with France over the status of Morocco would be the thing which brought Germany to war. But in the end, it was a diplomatic crisis involving Germany's ally, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, which ignited the powder keg in the summer of 1914. Europe's powers declared war on each other, one after another, in a cascade of declarations in late July and August, at the end of which Germany, along with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, was at war with Britain, France, Russia, and Serbia. Paulus was still a relatively junior officer at the outset of the war and did not have any sort of command during it. Instead, he emerged as a capable army bureaucrat attached to the Alpenkorps, a unit which was formed, as its name suggests, as a mountain unit. It initially fought in the Vosges region along the German border into eastern France, on the northern side of the Alps, but would later be deployed to the Balkans as well, fighting the Serbs there for a time in aid of Germany's Austro-Hungarian allies. This also brought Paulus for a time to his wife's native Romania, a nation which was neutral until 1916 and thereafter allied with Britain, France and Russia before being occupied by the Central Powers, at which time it was forced to conclude peace terms early in 1918. Paulus also saw service with the Alpenkorps at the famous Battle of Verdun on the Western Front in France. Throughout, he demonstrated his ability to manage the logistics of large army units and also a sense of diplomacy that augured the possibility of promotion through the general staff. He was awarded for his service, ending the war in November 1918 with the second and first class of the Iron Cross, while also being promoted to the rank of captain. The First World War did not so much end in a complete military victory for the Entente powers of Britain, France and their new ally, the United States, but instead saw Central Europe descend into a haze of revolution and anarchy as old empires collapsed and political radicals in Germany, Hungary and other places tried to establish communist governments in emulation of what had happened in Russia, in late 1917. Paulus was involved in efforts to stabilize the situation. The new Weimar Republic had been forced to demilitarize by the victorious powers, and so they relied on large numbers of Freikorps, army veterans who were employed as paramilitaries, to try and establish law and order across what remained of the German Empire. A document from Paulus's own papers, dating from 1937, clearly states that he was involved with the Freikorps in eastern Germany in 1919 as a brigade adjutant, though beyond this we know little about his actions during the German Revolution. More importantly, he was one of around 4,000 former officers of the German Imperial Army whose services were retained after the war within the new Reichswehr, the armed forces of the Weimar Republic. The German government had been commanded to reduce the size of its military to an upper limit of 100,000 men, and so the vast majority of German soldiers and officers were demobilized after the war. That Paulus's services were retained into the 1920s indicates that the general saw promise in him and his abilities as a military bureaucrat. Paulus's career in the 1920s involved steady promotion. It reflected his personality in being a story of calm competence, though no striking brilliance. In 1922, he was in Berlin undertaking further training as a staff officer. Then he spent much of the mid-1920s in Stuttgart as a general staff officer assigned to Reichswehr Group II. Eventually, in 1931, he was sent to Berlin to work as chief instructor within the Military of Defense. His role was to teach military history and basic tactics and logistics to junior officers, work which suited his nature. Perhaps the most notable feature of his work during this time was that he ended up in the Soviet Union teaching military tactics in Moscow periodically. In order to circumvent the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles and the caps that had been placed on Germany's military, the Weimar government had reached an agreement with the Soviet Union in the mid-1920s, whereby German military officers, who were widely regarded as the foremost military commanders in the world, went to Russia and trained Russian officers, while in return, the Russians allowed German military units to unofficially train on Soviet soil as irregular soldiers. Paulus was part of the officer exchange. He was also probably one of the numerous German officers during the 1920s and early 1930s who were conducting research into the innovations which were occurring in Britain and elsewhere in tank warfare. The Germans had been prohibited from maintaining either tank divisions or an air force under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, but the technology used in tanks was evolving rapidly elsewhere after they had only first arrived on the battlefields of Europe in 1916. The restrictions on German military activity and the size of its forces would soon be dismantled. One of the groups which had emerged out of the chaos of the German Revolution of 1919 and the years that followed were the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. Under their leader, Adolf Hitler, they had first tried to seize power militarily in Bavaria in 1923. But after Hitler's imprisonment and a temporary ban on the party, they decided to resort to the ballot box. They had little major success in the 1920s, but the Wall Street crash and the onset of the Great Depression saw a surge in popularity for the Nazis. By 1932, they were the largest political party in the country, with 1 in 3 Germans voting for them. That was enough for Hitler to be able to strike a Faustian bargain with the center-right political establishment and the business community in January 1933, one which rapidly led to Germany being turned into a one-party state. The Nazis were determined to overturn the Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany to its former power before eventually becoming the dominant power in Europe. To that end, as early as 1933, they began clandestinely increasing the country's military capabilities, while in March 1935, they essentially declared to the world that Germany was rearming, recruiting upwards of 500,000 men. This also involved the formation of a new air force, the Luftwaffe, and the incorporation of tank divisions into the new German armed forces, the Wehrmacht. Paulus was in a good position to earn swift promotion during this period of military expansion. The recruitment of hundreds of thousands of men meant that many new officers were needed and existing officers were promoted quickly. He found favor within the emerging tank divisions that were formed around the new Panzerwagen tanks that were soon being built as the core of the Wehrmacht's armored divisions. In 1935, he was promoted to the rank of colonel and was appointed as chief of staff of the headquarters of mechanized forces in Berlin. This meant that while he was not a general or a senior commander, Paulus was now the senior-most bureaucrat when it came to running the day-to-day operations of the tank divisions the Nazis were building. Much of this involved unimaginative bureaucratic work, but it also placed Paulus in a position of some influence. He taught up-and-coming tank commanders here and cultivated relationships with some individuals who would become the leading German generals of the Second World War, notably Heinz Guderian, the foremost tank commander of the war. In the spring of 1938, during a major shake-up of the Wehrmacht, as Hitler imposed full Nazi control over the leadership of the armed forces, Paulus was promoted to become the chief staff officer of Guderian's 16th Army Corps, a division which was largely a motorized tank unit by the time the Second World War was started by the Germans in September 1939. There is little indication of Paulus's rise during this time as being in any way the result of a personal relationship with Hitler. It seems he was simply perceived as an experienced and competent military officer. The Second World War was entered into when the Nazis invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, causing Britain and France to declare war on Germany 2 days later. By then, Hitler had already conquered Central Europe while barely firing a shot, annexing Austria in March 1938, the Sudetenland in September 1938, and then the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. In advance of the invasion of Poland, Paulus had been appointed as the chief of staff of the 10th Army that was being mobilized around Leipzig in the east of the country. He was also promoted to the rank of Major General. The assignment to the 10th Army was important, as this would subsequently become the 6th Army after the Polish campaign, and it was with this division of the Wehrmacht that Paulus would become infamously associated. The commander of the 10th Army during the 6-week-long Polish campaign was Walter von Reichenau. The 10th Army was charged with a thrust into central Poland towards Warsaw. In this capacity, it was central to the Battle of the Bzura River between the 9th and 19th of September, the decisive engagement of the short Polish campaign. Once victory was achieved there, the routeway to Warsaw was opened up, and the Polish government began preparing to head into exile. After the Polish campaign, the 10th Army was reconstituted as the 6th Army in mid-October 1939. Paulus's position remained the same, acting as Chief of Staff to von Reichenau as its commander. Over the next several months, the 6th Army, like so many other units, was relatively inactive. It was redeployed back into Germany in preparation for the invasion of France, but as the months ticked by, this did not materialize, a delay which famously led media outlets across the continent to speak of a phony war. When the real war began, it was swift. Denmark and Norway were quickly occupied in April 1940, as Hitler secured German control over much of the North Sea. Then, on the 10th of May 1940, the Western campaign began when the Nazi leadership ordered the invasion of Belgium and Luxembourg, as Germany had done in 1914, while the Netherlands were also invaded on this occasion. The Sixth Army was central to these efforts, with von Reichenau and Paulus's forces taking part in the Battle of Liège in Belgium, and then accepting the surrender of King Leopold III of Belgium on the 28th of May 1940. Thereafter, it played a central role in the French campaign, securing the northern outskirts of Paris and cutting off French forces in Normandy. Paulus was promoted at the end of the campaign into the Low Countries and France to the position of Oberquartiermeister of the German General Staff. This meant he was now one of the central planners of the overall military strategy within the Wehrmacht. He would consequently be involved in some of the planning for the Battle of Britain, which now commenced, though Hitler would soon lose interest in trying to defeat Britain, and his attentions would wander eastwards to the Soviet Union. Before Paulus was sent to the Eastern Front for what would become Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR in the summer of 1941, he was charged with observing what the strategic situation was in Italy and North Africa in the late spring of 1941. The Italians had entered the war early in June 1940. Their major theatres of activity in the year that followed were in North Africa and the Balkans. Both operations had proved disastrous, and in the spring of 1941, the Germans had dispatched the Africa Corps under Erwin Rommel to Africa. Paulus was ordered to go and see what the strategic situation was in April 1941 and report back. He spent some time in Rome before traveling onwards to Libya, where he spent 2.5 weeks inspecting the situation. There he concluded that Rommel was exceeding his authority and did not have the strategic situation in hand, something which many would have disagreed with. He only shied away from recommending that Rommel be replaced in an effort to acquire control of the Africa Corps because his wife advised him to have nothing to do with the African theatre. His life would have ended very differently if he had followed his instinct and acquired control of the Africa Corps. Back in Central Europe after his Africa detour, in late May 1941, Paulus was central to the final planning of the invasion of the Soviet Union. He was not one of the senior strategists. Instead, he provided details on logistics and various other matters. In this capacity, he remained behind the front lines after Operation Barbarossa commenced on the 22nd of June 1941. There is an intriguing account of a meeting he had with General Lieutenant Heinrich Kirchheim during this summer, in which the two discussed the possibility that the Soviets had a substantial capacity to move their armaments factories and other elements of the war economy to the Ural Mountains and east of them. If this were so, then the reality was that Hitler's strategy of capturing Moscow and Leningrad quickly and inducing the rapid surrender of the Soviets could be deeply flawed. It is evident from snippets of information like this that Paulus had serious doubts about Hitler's overall capacity to lead the German war effort. At a meeting with Hitler at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in Prussia on the 6th of August 1941, Paulus subtly raised some of his reservations to little effect. Instead, he and Guderian, whose tank divisions were now working closely with the Sixth Army on the Eastern Front, expressed concern that they were being ordered into Ukraine to seize Kyiv. Paulus and Guderian contended that Moscow was surely the priority, and a diversion of a significant proportion of the Wehrmacht southwards to Kyiv would make it impossible to secure Moscow before the winter set in. Their doubts were well founded, and the failure of the German campaign rested in part on these tactical mistakes. Despite Paulus and Guderian's reservations, the German 6th Army was assigned to Army Group South, the army group which was tasked with moving from Poland into Ukraine and securing Kiev. Army Group Center was headed for Moscow, and the Army Group North for Leningrad. The plan was for Army Group South to secure Kiev quickly and then move northwards to aid Army Group Center in capturing Moscow before the winter. Despite unexpectedly heavy rain in the initial stages of the advance, Army Group South, and with it the 6th Army, made good progress in the eastwards advance into Ukraine in July and August 1941. This early stage of the Eastern Campaign was marked by German encirclements of huge parts of the Red Army and the capture of hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. These encirclements would involve tank divisions under commanders like Guderian and other highly mobile units advancing in an arc to outflank the enemy and then circling them at the rear, while the slower infantry units pressed forward from the west. In this manner, the Germans inflicted enormous losses on the Soviets in the late summer and autumn of 1941. Though the effectiveness of encirclement was observed by the Russians and would be used to devastating effect against Paulus a year later. Meanwhile, Army Group South pushed forward and captured Kiev towards the end of September. The capture of Kiev and the days that followed brought one of the darkest incidents on the Eastern Front, one which Paulus was clearly associated with. On the 29th and 30th of September, just a few days after the final fall of Kiev, the 6th Army was responsible, in conjunction with the SS Einsatzgruppen and other units, for the mass murder of some 33,000 Ukrainian Jews at Babi Yar, near the Ukrainian capital. Less than 2 weeks later, Paulus's commanding officer and mentor, von Reichenau, issued what has become known as the Severity Order. In this, it was stated that the German soldier needed to be willing to exact, quote, severe but just retribution against the Jewish people and other non-German racial groups. Paulus's reputation has certainly suffered through association with these actions, although there is little evidence of his role in the Babi Yar atrocities. The blame there within the 6th Army lies firmly with von Reichenau, who it is clear from reading the Severity Order was wholly committed to the ideological goals of the Nazi leadership in invading the Soviet Union. Conversely, Paulus made efforts months later, when he succeeded von Reichenau as head of the 6th Army, to moderate the conduct of the soldiers under his command, issuing a decree early in 1942 which came close to rescinding the Severity Decree. Paulus appears to have been a political moderate, a soldier following orders rather than a zealous Nazi, though he was ultimately very guarded in expressing his political views, and he is difficult to interpret in this respect. In the early winter of 1941, the German advance into the Soviet Union faltered. The plan had been to win a short, sharp victory in Russia by capturing both Moscow and Leningrad and bringing the campaign to a quick conclusion, much like had occurred in Western Europe in the summer of 1940. But Russia is a different country to France. With the Germans spread out along an enormous front in October 1941, and after more than 3 months of relentless advances over 1,000 kilometers eastwards, they simply began to slow down, needing to refuel, rest, and take stock. The Soviets also began to offer stiffer resistance. Moscow and Leningrad did not fall in October or November or December, and the war dragged on into 1942, with it now becoming clear that a longer conflict was inevitable, particularly so after the United States entered the war in December 1941 and formed a grand alliance with Britain and the Soviets. German strategic thinking would now turn to capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus in order to secure German petroleum supplies and also to deprive the Soviets of their own supply, something which it was hoped would compensate for the failure to take Moscow and Leningrad. The southern city of Stalingrad, modern-day Volgograd, would soon be viewed as the key to the Caucasus. Meanwhile, Paulus had been promoted to his most senior command yet, head of the German Sixth Army, after its commander, Walter von Reichenau, was promoted to become the head of Army Group South on the Eastern Front. Paulus continued the eastwards drive towards Stalingrad after taking up his command of the Sixth Army in January 1942. The advance was delayed by the need to secure the south flank by capturing the Crimean Peninsula, a task which Erich von Manstein oversaw between late 1941 and the early summer of 1942. Once this was completed, Paulus was able to press forwards much faster. The Nazi and Soviet approach to the Battle of Stalingrad was captured in two different directives issued by Hitler and Stalin. In the case of the Nazi leader, he issued Führer Directive No. 41 on the 5th of April 1942. This laid out the Wehrmacht's strategic plan for the Eastern Front going forward, including the main elements of what is known as Fall Blau, Case Blue, the plan for capturing Stalingrad and then securing the oil fields southwards into the Caucasus around what are now Grozny in Chechnya and Baku in Azerbaijan. The need to secure these was stressed as Germany had exhausted its oil reserves in the winter of 1941 and was now almost completely reliant on its ally Romania's oil fields for its supply. The direct Soviet equivalent of Führer Directive No. 41 was Order No. 227, which Stalin issued on the 28th of July 1942. This came less than 2 weeks after the Battle of Stalingrad had effectively commenced on the steppe west of the city. In it, Stalin issued the famous phrase, "Ni shagu nazad," not a step back. From these, it is clear that both leaders considered Stalingrad to be vital to the wider war. Over the next 7 months, the Battle of Stalingrad turned into the crucible of the Second World War, and arguably the bloodiest military engagement in the history of the world. Paulus began his offensive on the 17th of July 1942, at which stage he was well over 100 kilometers west of Stalingrad itself. As well as the Sixth Army and German auxiliaries, he had the 4th Panzer Army to call on, extensive air support, and very considerable aid from the Axis allies, with the Italians, Romanians, and Hungarians having been convinced to supply hundreds of thousands of troops to support an engagement that was now deemed the #1 priority in the war. Still, there were deficiencies in the Axis forces, namely a lack of adequate anti-armored units. The first priority, one which was achieved in the second half of July and early August, was to secure the bend of the River Don, which lies some 70 kilometers west of Stalingrad. Thereafter, they made slow but steady progress towards Stalingrad in August, reaching the western suburbs of the city by the 23rd of the month, and inflicting considerable casualties on the Red Army along the way. Although some military historians argue that the advance should have been much faster here and that the roots of German defeat in the battle lay in the failure to move into and quickly capture the city by early September. Vicious urban warfare followed in late August through September and into October. The city was essentially reduced to rubble, and Paulus's forces did succeed in capturing almost 90% of Stalingrad. But the Red Army remained entrenched on the banks of the River Volga and were preventing Paulus from securing the city through sheer attrition, pumping men into the city and using blocking units to ensure that anyone who tried to retreat was machine-gunned down by their own comrades. By the beginning of November 1942, Stalingrad had become one of the grisliest war settings the world has known. The city was a bombed-out husk, with bodies everywhere, freezing conditions killing many of those who were not murdered either by the enemy or their own commanders, and trench warfare even being resorted to. It was particularly costly for the Soviets. Over 1 million men lost their lives fighting for the Red Army in a period of just over 6 months. Red Army casualties topping 250,000 men per month during the worst of it in September, October and November 1942. Nevertheless, they had held on, and on the 19th of November 1942, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus. Through this, they used the strategy of encirclement that the Germans had deployed themselves to such devastating effect throughout the war against them. Instead of striking at Paulus's 6th Army at Stalingrad itself, the Russians engaged in 2 pincer movements from the north and south, well west of Stalingrad, striking at the weaker Romanian forces that were defending the rear of the German lines on the steppe west of the 6th Army. Then the 2 forces moved north and south, converging with one another and trapping the 6th Army within Stalingrad and the lands to the west of it. However, Paulus and his men still had control of an extensive territory, and the Russian encirclement was stretched very thin across a large front. Had they attempted a breakout at this juncture, they would have possibly been able to do so. With every passing day, though, thereafter, the Germans tightened the noose and the encirclement closed in around the 6th Army, always with the seemingly unending supply of Red Army soldiers reinforcing the Russian positions. Beyond the usual correspondence, military records, and other administrative sources that are available in huge numbers for studying a military clash like the Battle of Stalingrad, we also have an uncommonly intimate portrait of Paulus's actions on the Eastern Front between the autumn of 1942 and the spring of 1943. This is in the shape of Wilhelm Adam's memoir of the battle. Adam was a contemporary of Paulus's, a man just a few years younger, though unlike him, an individual who had become a member of the Nazis very early on in the 1920s, and had played a role in the infamous beer hall putsch in Munich in 1923. On the Eastern Front, he became Paulus's aide-de-camp and spent a lot of time in Paulus's company throughout the Battle of Stalingrad. Many years later, he wrote a memoir of his time at Stalingrad, one which focuses on Paulus and his actions and has been published in English translation under the title With Paulus at Stalingrad. Adam had remained loyal to Paulus after the war and worked with him after both men returned to what was then East Germany in the 1950s, and he claimed his motivation for writing was to produce a vindication of Paulus's leadership of the 6th Army, of a kind which Paulus himself had hoped to write but never got round to before he died. It has the additional benefit of continuing the narrative through to 1948 and the years after they were captured by the Russians in 1943, though as an effort at an exculpatory account, it must be handled with some level of caution. These caveats aside, Adam's memoir provides a valuable insight into where Paulus was psychologically as the Battle of Stalingrad turned in the Soviets' favor with Operation Uranus in late November 1942. Adam recounted how Paulus's initial response, once the severity of the situation became clear, was to send a request to the Wolf's Lair in Prussia to be allowed to break out of the encirclement to the southwest. Hitler refused this request, and Paulus resigned himself to following his orders to hold steady. In meetings over the final week of November 1942 and into December, Paulus and his junior commanders expressed surprise at some of the orders they received from Hitler and the High Command, ones which seemed to not fully understand the severity of the situation at Stalingrad. It did not improve as December went on. By the middle of the month, the Germans were nearly out of supplies, and with their supply lines sundered, were reliant on airdrops to provide them with food and ammunition. Nothing near enough was being received, and by mid-December, the Sixth Army was slaughtering its horses to eat. One evening, as the officers dined together, Paulus was called away for a phone call from headquarters in Prussia. When he returned, instead of having news about the strategic situation, Paulus informed them that he had been told that Adam was to be awarded the Knight's Cross, a great military honor, though clearly one which Adam did not see the point of years later when he reflected on it. He entitled a section of his memoir here as, quote, "Medals and propaganda instead of bread." With the situation continuing to deteriorate inside the Stalingrad pocket, Erich von Manstein, who had recently been placed in charge of Army Group Don that was to the west beyond the Soviet encirclement, was tasked with attempting to break through the Soviet lines and sunder the encirclement. This enterprise was codenamed Operation Winter Storm. It was launched on the 12th of December 1942. As von Manstein's men pushed eastwards against the Red Army, Paulus would direct some of his forces to attack the Soviet encirclement from the eastward side, the goal being to re-establish lines of supply and reinforcements so that the push to seize Stalingrad could again commence. As deluded an objective as this now was, Winter Storm was compromised from the beginning. Paulus's men were weakened through hunger and the cold, while von Manstein's assault relied significantly on the 4th Panzer Army, which was inadequately supplied, a sign of how stretched the German war effort now was on the Eastern Front. Despite these limitations, the Red Army commanders were not expecting an attempt to sunder the encirclement, and von Manstein's forces made progress in the first few days of fighting. Thereafter, however, as the Russians responded to the surprise attack and moved forces to plug the hole in their lines, they began to force Army Group Don backwards. Operation Winter Storm had failed before Christmas 1942. Over Christmas and into the new year, the mood was grim within the Stalingrad pocket. The Red Army was slowly closing in, narrowing the encirclement. At the same time, they were unhurried about doing this. Paulus and the Sixth Army were effectively under siege, within a large open-air stretch of territory around western Stalingrad and the region to the west of the city. Though they were not trapped behind walls, they were being starved into submission as surely as the defenders of any medieval castle would have been during a siege. Still, Paulus insisted on fighting on. He knew the situation was hopeless at Stalingrad, but he reflected that the battle was tying up hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers that would be freed to go and fight Army Group Don and other German armies on the Eastern Front if he surrendered. Plus, surrender was deemed unconscionable for a German military commander. It was a sign of how desperate the situation was that when the Red Army commander at Stalingrad, Konstantin Rokossovsky, offered generous surrender terms on the 7th of January 1943, Paulus conveyed the details by radio to the Wolf's Lair in Prussia. Hitler refused to allow him to surrender. There was no clear purpose to continuing to hold out at this stage. There was no hope of relief. Tens of thousands of soldiers of the Sixth Army were suffering from starvation or frostbite, and their circumstances would only get worse. Whether they died or were taken prisoner, they were now of no use to the German war effort. The end finally came towards late January. In the middle of the month, the Red Army had forced Paulus's ragtag remnants of an army back into the ruins of the west of the city of Stalingrad itself. They then captured the airfields that the Germans had been using to get in what meager supplies were arriving to the troops. With this cut off, the soldiers of the Sixth Army began to starve to death. They were also running out of bullets to fire at the Red Army as fierce urban warfare began again of the kind which had characterized the street battles of the previous September and October. The only difference being that then the Germans were on the verge of capturing the whole city. Now they were trapped within it and facing complete defeat. As January came to an end, Paulus yet again relayed fresh surrender terms that had been offered back to the High Command. He was again informed that they were not to be accepted. Late on the 30th of January, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, the highest rank in the German military. The promotion came with a reminder that no German field marshal had ever surrendered to an enemy. Clearly, the Nazi dictator believed that Paulus was faltering, and he was not wrong. The following morning, on the 31st of January 1943, just moments after he received word of his promotion, Paulus was also informed that the Red Army were outside the building. Though it is usually stated that Paulus surrendered to the Red Army, it seems that he was about to be captured anyway. The graver issue in the eyes of many Germans afterwards was that he accepted detention rather than taking his own life. Elements of the Sixth Army would continue to fight on in various isolated parts of the city until the 2nd of February, but on that day the Battle of Stalingrad, the crucible of the Second World War, ended in a complete Soviet victory. At the start of the Battle of Stalingrad in the late summer of 1942, the Sixth Army had consisted of over 300,000 German soldiers. Moreover, they were some of the most experienced veterans of the Wehrmacht and were aided by hundreds of thousands of other German soldiers and allied Romanians, Italians, and Hungarians. In the beginning of February 1943, the Red Army rounded up just over 90,000 bedraggled and starving men, the remnants of Paulus's Sixth Army. Between dead and wounded, the Axis powers had suffered upwards of 1 million casualties, while also losing thousands of tanks and planes and over 10,000 heavy guns. Over 1 million Soviets had lost their lives, and 1 million more were wounded or otherwise missing or incapacitated. In a war in which some battles saw 7 or 8 Soviet soldiers killed for every German taken out of action, the ratio of German casualties to Soviet casualties was enormously high, and the Germans simply could not afford these kinds of losses at this stage in the war. After Stalingrad, the tide turned on the Eastern Front. 1943 was characterized by bitter fighting within Russia itself, but thereafter, the Red Army began making huge progress in pushing the Germans and their allies back into Poland, Ukraine, and then into the Balkans and Eastern Germany. Stalingrad was the most decisive engagement of the Second World War, though to what extent Paulus was responsible for the German failure, or was simply the commander, misfortunate enough to be tasked with the endeavor, is very open to debate. After the fighting ended, the 90,000 or so German captives were rounded up. They were provided with little of the medical aid and sustenance that had been promised throughout January. One soldier later recounted a Russian soldier turning around to a German after they had surrendered and pointing at the ruins of Stalingrad and saying, quote, "We're going to do that to Berlin." Then they were made to march into the freezing cold of the latter end of the Russian winter. The death march would last for several months and led to the deaths of an estimated 75,000 or so of the survivors. With further deaths in the year that followed, only 6,000 or so of the German POWs from Stalingrad were still alive when the war ended. These were settled in Western Russia late in 1943 and efforts were made there to convince them to join a National Committee for a Free Germany, an organization which had been established in Russia for Germans who were opposed to the Nazis' regime. Paulus survived the death march, perhaps because he received favorable treatment, the Soviets being aware of the propaganda value of turning him against Hitler and the Nazis. They succeeded in this mission. In the second half of 1944, he began to criticize the Nazi government, which he now saw as having orchestrated the destruction of Germany. While he was becoming part of the National Committee for a Free Germany in Russia, Paulus's family suffered at home. His wife Elena Constance, his daughter Olga, and one of his twin sons, Ernst Alexander, were placed into the Sippenhaft program, a means whereby the families of traitors to the Third Reich were punished by the Nazi regime in their absence. Sippenhaft literally meaning kin liability. The other son, Friedrich Jr., was allowed to continue serving in the military and was killed near Anzio on the Italian front early in 1944. Wilhelm Adam's memoir provides one of the best accounts of Paulus in his years in captivity in Russia, a period during which his correspondence was otherwise monitored and controlled by the Soviets. Adam claims that one of the factors which convinced many of the German survivors from Stalingrad to join the Soviet cause were the events of the final months of the war. Hitler was arming teenage boys and pensioners to fight in his futile defense of Berlin, an unconscionable action in the eyes of Paulus, Adam, and others who saw in this a repeat of their orders to hold firm at Stalingrad even once their position was doomed. At the same time, the blanket bombing of the city of Dresden in February 1945 by the Western Allies was presented to the German captives in Russia as evidence of the brutality of Western imperialists like the United States, as the Soviets tried to win over Paulus and others to the communist cause. When the war finally ended in May 1945, plans were initiated to try the leaders of the Nazi regime at Nuremberg. Paulus was called to testify, and there he implicated two of his senior commanders in fomenting the war as Hitler's close accomplices: Wilhelm Keitel, the head of the Wehrmacht between 1938 and 1945, and Alfred Jodl, the chief of the operational staff of the Wehrmacht throughout the war. Both men were found guilty and executed on the 16th of October 1946. After testifying at Nuremberg in 1946, Paulus was sent back to Russia. He was not allowed to return home to Germany, and he would never see his wife again. She died there in 1949, having not seen her husband since he had left for the Stalingrad offensive in 1942. Paulus, Adam, and the many other German POWs were kept in camps and facilities in Russia in and around Moscow in the years that followed. They were no longer prisoners of war in the standard sense. They had a fair degree of freedom and were treated well, but it was still clear that they were not allowed to return to Germany. In the summer of 1947, many of them met each other for the first time in months when they were taken by train to Stalingrad. Adam noted that even over 4 years after Paulus and the men of the 6th Army had been captured there, the rubble and detritus of the battle was still everywhere to be seen, with burnt-out tanks and vehicles littering the steppe outside the city, and the husks of destroyed buildings jutting out next to new ones which had been built out of the ruins. There the German survivors were filmed for a Soviet propaganda film. Back at Termelino near Moscow, on the 31st of March 1948, Adam and several others were informed that they would be allowed to return home to Germany, but not Paulus, who nevertheless congratulated Adam on his full release. By the time Adam and the others left Paulus in Russia and headed home to Germany, the country was still divided into Soviet, US, British and French spheres of occupation, though the Soviet zone would be turned into Communist East Germany the following year, and the three other zones were formed into a pro-Western West Germany. Paulus would not be allowed to return home after the others for another 5 years. He was finally released in October 1953. This was just a few months after Stalin's death, and it seems likely that the Soviet dictator was the final impediment to his release. Paulus was a committed adherent to the Soviet camp in the Cold War by then and settled in East Germany, despite being a native of a part of central Germany which now lay in West Germany. He headed to live in Dresden within a few days of arriving to Berlin and would spend the final years of his life there. There he reconnected quickly with Wilhelm Adam and also many other former German officers. In 1954, they held a meeting in which they sought to bring together veterans living in both West and East Germany as a means of improving relations between the two parts of the nations that were now antagonists. On the 2nd of July 1953, shortly after he returned to Germany, Paulus gave a talk in Berlin which he entitled "On the Vital Issues of Our Nation." Here he set out his political views, such as they were after a decade living in the Soviet Union and having lived through an immensely traumatic period for Europe, Germany, and for himself as an individual. Paulus made it clear that he remained first and foremost a German patriot, and commended Heinz Guderian, who had died 7 weeks earlier, as one as well. He was blunt in laying the blame for Germany's division into two countries and its modern woes on the leadership of it during the First and Second World Wars. Yet he was equally critical of foreign adversaries, particularly the United States, which he framed as the new imperial power. He struck a more conciliatory tone when it came to France and called for an end to the near century-long enmity which had existed between the two neighbors since the Franco-Prussian War had resulted in the formation of the German Empire in the early 1870s. Then he called for a breaking down of the barriers which had only so recently been formed between West and East Germany. Here he was talking about the psychological, ideological and political barriers between the two nations. He would be disappointed to learn that in the early 1960s, those would turn into physical barriers when a wall was built all the way around West Berlin by the communist regime, which Paulus now supported. In all particulars, Paulus called for a rejuvenation and reunification of Germany in his speech in Berlin in the summer of 1953. But it would be nearly 4 decades before that could be achieved. Paulus lived out his final years in Dresden in East Germany. Like many other senior German commanders who had survived the war and escaped with relatively light punishments, he spent much of the end of his life trying to galvanize the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. Central to this were Guderian and von Manstein, both of whom composed memoirs and books after the war, arguing that the German military had been following in the line of the Prussian military, stretching back into the 18th and 19th centuries by following orders received from the civil government, and that the crimes of the Third Reich were attributable to the Nazis as a political party rather than the Wehrmacht as a separate entity. It appears that Paulus had intended to produce his own memoir as a contribution to this and had enlisted the aid of Adam to do so, though he would die before furthering the project. In any event, the myth of the clean Wehrmacht is viewed today as being exactly what it is, a myth. Some commanders like Paulus might have had much graver reservations about the conduct of the German armed forces on the Eastern Front, but they were nevertheless deeply implicated in the atrocities committed at places like Babi Yar. Paulus spent his final years in Dresden working at the Military History Research Institute there. He was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease in 1956, a neurodegenerative condition. He died before it detracted from his quality of life too much, passing away at home in Dresden on the 1st of February 1957 at 66 years of age. His body was repatriated to West Germany and he was laid to rest in Baden alongside his wife. Friedrich Paulus stands out amongst the German generals of the Second World War in being primarily well known today for a defeat rather than his victories. Most of the Nazi commanders, whose names are widely known today, won substantial victories, whether it be Erich von Manstein and his multiple successes in places like Crimea, Heinz Guderian and the role his panzer divisions played in the German Lightning War, Blitzkrieg, or Erwin Rommel, and the manner in which his small Afrika Korps temporarily changed the face of the fighting in North Africa, Paulus's inaccurate criticism of him in May 1941 aside. By way of contrast, Paulus is known for having lost the Battle of Stalingrad, nothing else. The engagement resulted in the complete destruction of the 6th Army, the loss of an entire tank army, upwards of 1,000 aircraft, and the loss of hundreds of thousands of Allied Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops. In all, the loss at Stalingrad deprived the Nazi state of around 10% of all the military resources it would be able to deploy during the war. Paulus, though, was really just a stooge. It was Hitler's blind refusal to allow the 6th Army to retreat once they failed to take the city in the autumn of 1942 that allowed the Soviets to use the Germans' own encirclement strategies against them so effectively through Operation Uranus. Once trapped on the steppe, west of the city, with the winter setting in, Paulus and his men were waiting for death, capture or rescue, and he repeatedly requested to be allowed to attempt a breakout. While Paulus was the individual in charge on the ground, ultimately the defeat at Stalingrad was owing to Hitler's decisions. The battle will forever be remembered as the crucible of the war, following which the Allies began to rapidly dismantle the Nazi Third Reich. What do you think of Friedrich Paulus? Was he responsible for the German defeat at Stalingrad, or was he placed in a strategically impossible position by Hitler? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.